Hi, year 11s and 12s. Today we're going to be looking at the second PowerPoint in our ecosystems or ecologies topic. Remember, this is an IB PowerPoint, so this is for the IB. This is an SL topic for ecology, and we're looking at Unit 4.2. Now, there'll only be one video for this PowerPoint, so I will show the need to know in this PowerPoint. Remember, this is currently for the 2020 curriculum for biology. So those need-to-know statements will reflect that curriculum. So over here we've got our need-to-knows. I'm not going to go through these. As you can see, there's not many understandings and one skill that you need to be able to do from this topic, but there's not many. If you'd like to write these down, good spot to pause the video and write them down. But let's physically begin talking about the content. So first off, we need to talk about the source of energy. So where does energy come from in general across our entire ecosystem? Okay, and in order for all organisms to survive, they need energy in order to live. Okay, where that energy comes from in the entire food chain is most organisms will, if you trace the energy back far enough, would have obtained that energy from the sun. Now that starts with green plants. Green plants will absorb that light energy from the sun, and they'll convert that into chemical energy in the form of glucose through a process we know as photosynthesis, which you can sort of see in this diagram over here. As you can see that we have light energy and an inorganic molecule coming in. In this case, we have carbon dioxide and water, and in the presence of that light, we are making chemical energy, which is stored inside our glucose molecules, and we're also releasing some oxygen. Okay. Glucose is important because glucose can provide plants with the energy they require. When we break it down, we can create ATP. When heterotrophs eat those plants, they'll also get the energy that's stored in those glucose, and they can break that down again to release ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Whenever those organic compounds are broken down via cell respiration, which for now we'll just say is the opposite reaction of photosynthesis. There's actually a lot more to it, but we'll talk about that when we get into molecular biology. ATP will be produced, which allows us to fuel our metabolic processes. Okay, so this is how we start. The sun's plants capturing the energy from the sun, and they're physically turning that into chemical energy that we can use to power metabolism. How does that energy get passed on? And that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay. As we talked about last week, in each community, energy is passed on from one trophic level to another, with some loss at each level. Okay, and at each level, some of that energy will be used for producing new materials, carrying out our functions, and then the rest is lost, for example, as heat energy, which we'll talk about a little bit further. Okay. In general, most energy is going to enter an ecosystem or a community as light, and it's going to exit that community or ecosystem as heat. Okay, only a very small portion is trapped in the bodies of an organism, and that energy that's stored in the organism we call biomatter. Okay, or biomass. Okay, it's common that about 10% of the energy at one trophic level is transferred to the next level, which we'll look at a little bit more. But we also need to talk about why this energy is disappearing so much.
Why is the
energy
always gone?
Which is where we get to at this point here. If we're talking about the energy and where it's disappearing to, we need to talk about warm and cold-blooded. So warm-blooded herbivores, particularly inefficient at food conversion. Our statistics say that they have about 1 to 2% efficiency converting the energy they're getting from those plants to biomass, and that's because of their heat. They have to monitor their internal temperature, make sure it's staying in an optimum condition in order to get their enzymes to function correctly. So they're using a lot of that energy to maintain their internal body heat, which means we're losing a lot as heat energy. Okay, so they're less efficient. Whereas a cold-blooded animal is not using that energy to physically heat up its body, so they reach about 10% efficiency. Okay, so the reason that we lose so much energy at each level is down to 3 different points. One of those is that herbivores don't eat a large amount of the dead matter that's available to them. So when something a producer dies, that matter dies and becomes basically broken down by decomposers rather than eaten by the herbivores. So therefore herbivores aren't physically able to take in that energy because it's not available to them. Okay. On the other hand, not all food going into the herbivore is physically being turned into body tissue. Considerable amount is lost as feces, might be heat transfer, lots of different things. So the energy that's actually physically coming in from that food is not being used just to store and create biomass and increase the mass and energy of the animal. Okay, those two forms of energy loss, so matter being lost to decomposers, as well as body heat, as well as not all the food going to the herbivore, some being used in feces, they're really small compared to the amount of lost by heat in a community, which we can sum up a little bit more when we're looking at this slide. Okay, so whenever an organism takes in that energy, it can be converted into a number of different forms. So it might be kinetic energy when they're doing muscular contractions, might be electrical energy when they're sending nerve impulses throughout their body, might be light energy when they're becoming bioluminescent. So that's obviously not all organisms there. Okay, but the one thing that all three of those reactions and those energy transformations has is they release heat as a byproduct. Okay, living organisms can't physically capture that heat and turn it into usable energy, which means any heat that's released from that organism is potentially lost from the ecosystem. Okay, and that's why we need this constant influx of energy coming from the sun. Okay, so at every point in this chain here, we've got chemical energy in producers, losing some as heat. Chemical energy in primary consumers, lost as heat. Chemical energy in secondary consumers, lost as heat. In the apex predator, or your top consumer, lost as heat. Decomposers, lost as heat. This heat is never getting reabsorbed back into the ecosystem. It's just moving off into space and being lost. Okay, where on this side, when we are actually, so the last slide we talked about some energy is lost from the organism because it's not being eaten up because it's already dead. Decomposers are actually taking that energy still back in. That energy is not lost, but they're still releasing heat. So we're still losing energy as heat. The heat is never coming back in. Okay. Talking about how efficient an organism is, we need to talk about a few terms. Biomass is a term that we've already talked about in this PowerPoint quite a bit. Biomass is basically the total mass of a group of organisms. So how much mass there is in a group of organisms. Okay. Because carbon compounds store energy, we can measure how much energy is added to organisms by an increase in biomass. Okay. We also know that biomass will decrease as we go along a food chain. So there'll be more biomass at the producer level than there will be at the apex predator or quaternary consumer level. Okay. Higher trophic levels. Because of this, we know that that will limit the amount of top consumers we can have, and it can also limit how many consumer levels there are in a food chain. So if we look at this diagram over here, starting with the sun, we've got 100 litres of energy. Obviously we don't generally measure energy in litres, but for this time we are. Okay, so sun's got 100 litres of energy. The plant is only roughly getting 10% of that. It's got 10 litres of energy stored in the plant. Okay. When the fly takes some of that in, now we only have 1 litre because we've lost that 10% again. The frog then comes along to eat the fly, and all of a sudden we've only got 100 mils, 10% of that 1 litre. Then the snake comes and eats the frog. Now we've only got 10 mils of energy. Okay, so then we move on to finally to the hawk, who's getting 1 mil of energy. And while going through 5 different organisms, we've gone from 100 litres of energy to 1 mil of energy. Now, if we're to take 10% again of this, how much food does that 5th order consumer have to eat? The food chain can't sustain it and it becomes unviable. Okay, so because we're losing so much energy at each level, that limits how many levels we can have in a food chain. Okay, because essentially anything beyond this hawk has got to use so much energy up to find food that it's not going to be able to survive on the food. It's using more energy to hunt the food than it is to physically get from the food. Okay. This can all be shown through a biomass or a pyramid of energy. Okay. Now, this is the skill for this PowerPoint, so this is one of the skills that you might have to talk about in the exam. Okay. We use pyramids of energy to graphically show the amount of energy found at each trophic level. So because of that, the pyramids will always look like an actual pyramid and not a reverse pyramid. They'll always look like a actual upright pyramid, okay, with the bottom level showing your producer. Okay, so producer here with our 10,000 joules of energy. Then we have our snail, our primary consumer, getting 10% of that with 1,000 joules of energy. Then we have our secondary consumer, our frog, getting 100 joules of energy. And finally, our tertiary consumer getting 10 joules of energy. Okay, so each time, the fox has to eat more frogs in order to get the energy. So a fox would have to eat 10 frogs to get the same amount of energy that the frog gets from eating one snail. Okay, energy is being lost along the food chain, so the higher order organisms have to physically eat more in order to get more energy. So that's why they're limited in numbers.